What pleases God is to see me love my littleness and poverty, the blind hope that I have in His mercy. Saint Thérèse of Lisieux. Is there something you have been holding so tightly? A fear, a grief, a future you cannot stop trying to control, that your hands have grown sore from the grip? Have you ever stood in the middle of your ordinary life, in the kitchen, in the car, in the sleepless hours of the night, and wondered whether God is truly asking you to let go of the one thing you are most afraid to lose? And if He is asking that, if the invitation is real, do you honestly believe that what comes after surrender could ever be gentler than what you are carrying right now? There is a moment in the spiritual life that comes to almost everyone who is serious about God. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with thunder or vision. It arrives quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, or a sleepless Thursday, or a Sunday Mass where the words have started to blur together. And it asks a single devastating question. What if you actually let go? Not the partial letting go. Not the surrendering of the things that were never yours anyway. Not the release of old grudges that had already grown heavy enough to drop on their own. But real surrender. The handing over of the thing you have been managing, planning, protecting, and carrying since before you even knew how frightened you were. The thing that lives in the back of your mind like a low hum you have learned to tune out, but never actually stopped hearing. That moment, that terrifying, holy, narrow doorway, is what Saint Thérèse of Lisieux walked through. Not once in a blaze of mystical glory. Not in some dramatic hour of conversion that changed everything in an instant and left her standing in radiant peace. But daily, quietly, in the smallest and most unglamorous circumstances of her brief life, in the laundry room, in the chapel at Compline, in the conversations with novices that cost her more patience than she ever felt she had, in the long months of dying when neither her body nor her soul gave her anything to hold on to. And what she discovered on the other side of surrender, not once, but again and again, in the ordinary increments of a Carmelite day, is what we are here to explore together. This is the Teresa Channel, a place for souls who are drawn to her, who have felt her hand in their life even when they could not name what they were feeling, and who long to go deeper into the spirituality she lived and left us. If this is your first time here, welcome. If you have been here before, you already know what this space is. Subscribe, because what Thérèse teaches about surrender is not a lesson you hear once and file away. It is something you return to again and again at every new threshold, every new loss, every new door that will not open. And consider joining our membership community, a smaller, closer circle where we go deeper together, where your questions matter, and where Thérèse accompanies all of us in the particular darkness of our own moments. The link is below. Come in. You already know the feeling. It is the sensation of pressing your whole weight against something that will not move. A relationship that has gone silent in ways you cannot explain and cannot seem to reverse. A child who has walked away from the faith and from you and from the version of the future you had quietly been counting on. A health situation the doctors have measured and named and treated but cannot seem to fix, that has settled into your life like a tenant who will not leave. A vocation that has not opened. A door that has not responded to any of the knocking you have done. A prayer that has gone up so many times you have started to wonder whether it reaches any further than the ceiling. You have prayed. You have planned. You have done everything a reasonable, faithful, spiritually serious person could think to do. And still, the thing remains exactly where it was. Unmoved, unchanged, indifferent, it sometimes feels, to your entire effort. Sometimes in the honest hours before sleep or just after waking, you wonder whether all your effort has made any real difference at all. Thérèse knew this territory, not from a distance, from inside it, with her eyes open. She entered Carmel at 15 years old with a soul already on fire for God, and she carried inside her a longing that no human framework could adequately contain. She wanted to be a missionary, a priest, a martyr. She wanted, as she wrote in her autobiography, to accomplish all the works of love for the Church, the whole arc of heroic sanctity that history has assigned to the great saints of every age. She read about the missionaries dying in distant countries and felt the desire so acutely she described it as a suffering. She read about the early martyrs and recognized something in their death that her own soul wanted to claim. And she was a young woman in a cloistered convent in Normandy who spent her days doing laundry and sweeping corridors and teaching novices who were sometimes resistant and sitting in chapel at night fighting to stay awake during the night office. The gap between what she felt called to and what was actually available to her must have been, at times, not just bewildering but genuinely painful. But here is what she did not do. She did not collapse into despair. She did not conclude that God had made some error in her vocation, or that he had somehow miscommunicated what he wanted from her. She did not begin a quiet campaign to arrange her circumstances differently, pulling on the levers of influence available to a 19th century Carmelite, which were, in truth, vanishingly few. She stopped. She sat with the gap. She looked at it honestly, without flinching, and without spiritualizing it into something it wasn't. And then she did something that sounds simple and is, in practice, one of the most demanding acts a human soul can perform. She gave it to God, not as a performance, not as a strategy for achieving a different outcome through a more indirect route, not even as a surrender she fully understood or felt peaceful about in every moment. She gave it the way a child gives something precious to a parent, not because she no longer cared about it, but because she recognized, with the particular clarity that came to her early and stayed throughout her life, that her caring was not the same as her controlling, that her love for the church, vast and real as it was, did not require her to personally manage how that love was spent, that God could be trusted with the fruit of her fidelity even when she could not see what that fruit was or where it was going. This is not passivity. That is the first confusion people bring to the subject of surrender, and it is important to address it directly, because if we do not, the entire conversation tips into something that sounds like spiritual resignation, a kind of pious giving up dressed in the language of trust. What Thérèse practiced was not the spirituality of doing nothing and calling it trust. She was not passive. She worked with tremendous energy and fidelity in the small space that was actually hers. She wrote with extraordinary care. She prayed with her whole self, including the self that was exhausted and dry. She formed souls in the novitiate with a combination of honesty and gentleness that the novices themselves recorded. She showed up every single day to the particular life God had placed her in, rather than the grand one she might have designed for herself. But the outcome, the fruit, the actual results of all that faithfulness, those she did not try to hold. She released them. Again and again, in the ordinary moments of the day, she practiced the small but real act of placing the results of her fidelity into hands that were not hers. She wrote in one of her letters to her sister Celine, "I want to seek out a means of going to heaven by a little way, very short and very straight, a little path which is quite new." And the newness was precisely this, that the path did not require her to become enormous before God would use her. It did not require her to achieve a certain level of spiritual performance, or to accumulate a resume of heroic acts, or to become something other than what she was. It required her to become small, small enough to be carried, small enough to stop competing with God for the management of her own soul and the direction of her own life. Think for a moment, genuinely, not as a rhetorical exercise, about the thing you are carrying right now. Not the easy things, not the inconveniences and minor frustrations that anyone could drop without much interior work. The small irritations that resolve themselves in an afternoon. The real thing. The one that wakes you up at 3 in the morning. The one that lives in the back of your mind during Mass. Surfacing just when you are trying to be present. The one you have prayed about so many times that your prayers have started to feel like a script rather than a conversation. The words still going up, but the heart wondering if they are landing anywhere. What would it actually mean to give that to God? Not to stop caring about it? Not to pretend it doesn't exist or that it doesn't matter? Not to perform a kind of spiritual detachment that is really just suppression wearing a holy name? But to genuinely, with full awareness of what you are doing, place it in hands that are larger than yours. And then, in the moment when the impulse comes to take it back and try to manage it again yourself, to notice that impulse and choose differently. The answer looks different for every soul, and Thérèse would not pretend otherwise. But she would say this, that the moment of genuine surrender is rarely loud. It does not tend to feel triumphant. It does not arrive wrapped in consolation or accompanied by the felt certainty that everything is now going to be all right. It feels more often like a kind of interior exhale, quiet, a little frightening, possibly a little anticlimactic. And then gradually, in the days and weeks that follow, something begins to shift that you cannot quite name yet. The power of surrendering everything to God is not that things immediately rearrange themselves to suit your preferences. That would be transaction, not surrender. It is something slower and more profound than that. It is the discovery that God was already present in the thing you were trying to control, and that your grip, however well-intentioned, however rooted in love, was, in some ways, the very thing preventing you from feeling Him there. You cannot make the thing happen. That is not a failure. That is not a sign that you have not prayed enough or trusted enough or done the right spiritual work. That may be exactly where this begins. The thing that will not move under your own power is precisely the thing being offered to someone who moves what you cannot. There is a theology inside the word child that the modern spiritual imagination tends to flatten. We hear spiritual childhood, and we think of innocence, of simplicity, of something sweet and uncomplicated that adults are supposed to recover through some combination of meditation and intentionality and learning to be more present. And while presence and simplicity are not nothing, they are not what Thérèse meant. What she meant was structural, ontological, a complete reordering of the relationship between self and God that changes not just how you feel in prayer, but how you stand in the universe, where you locate your weight, whose arms you are ultimately trusting to hold you. A child, in the theological sense Thérèse inhabits, is not someone who is naive about suffering or difficulty. This matters enormously, because the caricature of Thérèse as a sweetly innocent girl who happened to say some lovely things before she died is one of the great misreadings of her life and teaching. Thérèse was not naive. She was, if anything, unusually clear-eyed. She had watched her mother die slowly of breast cancer when she was 4 years old enough to carry the memory but too young to frame it. She had seen her beloved sister Pauline leave home for Carmel when Thérèse was 9, a departure she described as losing her second mother, a grief so acute it produced a physical illness that baffled the doctors and that she herself later believed to have been spiritual in origin. She entered religious life at 15 and found it harder than she had imagined, not in dramatic ways, but in the steady, relentless friction of living in close community with imperfect people in an enclosed space, including the friction of living with herself. She served as novice mistress for souls who did not always want what she was offering, and in the final 18 months of her life, she endured a tuberculosis that consumed her body while her soul was held in a darkness so deep that she could barely glimpse the faith she had always lived by. A child for Thérèse is not someone to whom hard things have not happened. A child is someone who, despite hard things, does not conclude that they must become their own savior. That distinction matters more than almost anything else we could say about her spirituality. Because the alternative, the decision to become your own savior, to take on the full weight of your own spiritual formation and life management, is almost never experienced as a bad decision. It is experienced as responsibility, faithfulness, seriousness of purpose. The alternative to self-sufficiency seems to be, from the inside, irresponsibility. And so we remain industrious about our own souls with the quiet conviction that this industriousness is what God wants from us. But Thérèse looked at that arrangement and saw something important. That the spiritual impulse which looks most like faith is sometimes its opposite. The person who prays for 3 hours every morning manages their fasting with precision, engineers their spiritual practices to guarantee certain interior outcomes, monitors their progress in virtue with careful attention, and feels a subtle but real anxiety whenever the results seem insufficient. That person is not living in spiritual childhood. They are living in what might be called spiritual self-employment. The whole enterprise is subtly organized around the production of a self that God will be required to love. Which means, on the days when the self feels insufficient, when the prayer is dry and the virtue feels thin, and the morning's effort has not produced the interior state you were aiming for, on those days God seems far. Not because He is, but because the system you have built depends on you performing adequately, and today you are not. Thérèse understood this not because she was immune to it, but because she felt its pull and chose differently. She chose over and over in the ordinary decisions of a Carmelite day to let God be what He has always actually been, not the evaluator of her spiritual performance, not the one waiting to be impressed by the adequacy of her effort, but the source, the sustainer, the one who does not love her because of what she produces, but simply because she exists and because she is His. She wrote with the peculiar precision that marks all her best passages about the elevator, the image of a soul too weak to climb the staircase of spiritual perfection and who looks instead for the elevator which would raise me to Jesus. And she names the elevator, the arms of Jesus. Not technique, not effort organized more cleverly, not even virtue in the sense of accumulated moral achievement. The arms of Jesus. The simple, foundational, everything prior to method willingness to be carried. But here is what a child knows that a spiritually earnest adult sometimes forgets. Being carried requires you to stop walking under your own power, which means stopping, which means admitting, not with shame but with straightforward honesty, that you have reached the edge of what your own effort can accomplish, and that this edge is not a failure, but a threshold. How often do we approach God at precisely that point, the edge of our own resources, the moment when we have genuinely nothing left to offer, and then, before He can reach for us, before we have allowed ourselves to actually be held, we start walking again. Because stopping feels irresponsible. Because we were formed by a culture that equates rest with laziness and dependence with weakness. Because the habit of self-sufficiency is so deeply embedded in us, in our spiritual lives as much as anywhere else, that even in prayer, we are often presenting God with a progress report and asking Him to confirm that we are on track, rather than genuinely placing ourselves in His hands and letting Him determine what track we are on. The surrender Thérèse practiced was specifically precisely this: the willingness to stop generating yourself, to stop being the primary author of your own spiritual life and to let God author it. Not passively, she was always active, always faithful, always showing up. But the authorship, the direction, the final shape of it, those she surrendered. She brought her effort. She left the outcome with God. She brought her fidelity. She released the fruit. She brought herself exactly as she was, without improvement or editing, and she trusted that this self, imperfect, limited, often dry, sometimes resistant, was what God wanted in this moment. This sounds, written plainly like that, almost too simple to be true. It sounds like something you could nod at in a conversation and then return to your usual management of everything unchanged. And that gap between the intellectual agreement and the actual interior posture is precisely where Thérèse spent her whole life. Not writing about the gap from outside it, but living inside it, choosing daily, in the small and unspectacular circumstances of her enclosure, to practice what she was preaching before she had preached it. There is something you have been trying to generate by your own effort that only God can provide. You probably already know what it is. Peace, perhaps. The genuine kind, the kind that does not depend on the situation improving first. Or the assurance that a certain person will be all right, the person whose choices are breaking your heart and whose life you cannot arrange no matter how much you love them. Or the capacity to forgive someone whose action went so deep that forgiveness feels less like release and more like loss, like giving up the last form of control you had. Or simply the sense, on the flat and ordinary days, that your life is going somewhere meaningful, that the small and unglamorous faithfulness of your existence matters beyond what you can see or measure. A child does not produce these things. A child receives them. A child holds her empty hands out and trusts that the God who promised to be provider is present enough and near enough and attentive enough to fill them. And Thérèse would say to you, with the particular gentleness that characterizes all her spiritual correspondence, the gentleness of someone who is not speaking from above the difficulty but from inside it, that your inability to manufacture what only God can give is not a sign of your failure. It is the shape of your invitation. It is the exact contour of the place where surrender needs to happen. The arms are there. They have always been there. The question, the only question, is whether you are willing to stop walking long enough to fall into them. No one comes to genuine surrender through ease. This is the truth that Thérèse's life makes impossible to avoid. Not because she labored to make it obvious, but because it is written into the structure of her story, whether she intended it or not. And it is also the truth that much contemporary spiritual writing quietly edits out, because it is not comfortable to say and harder to sell. Surrender is presented sometimes as a kind of spiritual efficiency, a cleaner way of doing the spiritual life, a technique that, once you understand it, produces better interior results with less unnecessary friction. And there is something in that, eventually. But the path to it is almost never what people expect, and the entry point is almost never a moment of clarity and resolution. What leads most souls to real surrender is powerlessness, actual, unchosen, sometimes terrifying powerlessness. The moment when you have done everything available to you, everything prayer suggested, everything wisdom recommended, everything love could invent, and the situation has not changed, or has changed in ways you would not have chosen, and you are standing in what feels like the ruins of your own best effort with nothing left to offer. That moment, which feels like defeat, which is usually accompanied by grief or exhaustion or something uncomfortably close to despair, is, in the economy of God, an extraordinarily important and extraordinarily unwelcome gift. Thérèse received this gift in the last chapter of her life, and she did not experience it as a gift at the time. She was dying of tuberculosis at 24, and the physical suffering was, by the accounts of those who cared for her in those final months, genuinely severe. The hemorrhages, the breathlessness, the body's slow and relentless disintegration. But what she wrote about in the months before her death was not primarily the body, it was the soul. The darkness that descended on her faith in the final year and a half of her life, what she described as sitting at the table of sinners and sharing the meal of those who cannot taste God, was a trial she had not anticipated and could not resolve by any spiritual effort she brought to bear on it. She had built her entire interior life on the certainty of heaven, not as an abstract doctrine located somewhere in the catechism, as an experienced reality, the horizon she walked toward, the light she could feel even through closed eyes, the source of the particular lightness that characterized her whole personality. Heaven was not an idea for Thérèse. It was a destination she felt the closeness of daily. And then, in the last months of her life, that felt closeness was taken, not forever and not completely. The faith remained. She was clear about that, and careful not to claim it had disappeared. But the easy, luminous, experiential certainty that death opened into something infinitely better, the felt sense of God's nearness, the consolation that had accompanied her whole spiritual life, this was obscured as thoroughly as if a curtain had been drawn across it. And she was left with only what she had given, the naked act of trust, stripped entirely of its emotional confirmation. What did she do? She kept going. She did not perform peace she did not feel. Her letters from this period are remarkable precisely for their honesty, their refusal to dress the darkness in language borrowed from the light. She did not pretend the darkness was light, or spiritualize it into something that would be more comfortable to describe. She wrote honestly to her prioress about the experience, describing it with a specificity and clarity that should comfort every soul who has ever sat in that particular dark and wondered whether something had gone permanently wrong. And she made a choice. Not once, not in a single moment of resolution that settled everything, but continuously, daily, in the small and unglamorous increments of a Carmelite life that had contracted in those final months to a sick room, to trust what she could no longer feel, to place her weight on something she could not see, to act as though the God she had known in the light was still present in the dark, because the alternative, the conclusion that he was not, was the one thing she refused to accept without evidence, and the darkness itself was not evidence. Darkness is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of darkness. She wrote in a passage that has accompanied souls in their own dark nights ever since, "I believe I have made more acts of faith in this past year than all through my whole life." Not acts of felt certainty, not statements of confident spiritual experience. Acts of faith, the deliberate, willed, sometimes agonized choice to place her weight on something she could not see or feel or verify, because the God she had known in the light was the same God who was present, she chose to believe, in the dark. This is the dark gift of powerlessness. Not that suffering is beautiful. Thérèse would not say that. Not that God sends anguish as a reward for faithfulness, or that pain should be sought for its own sake. She was clear that suffering is not the goal, only the terrain, but that the experience of being brought to the absolute end of your own resources, when everything you used to rely on spiritually has been stripped, when the felt consolations have gone quiet, when even prayer feels like speaking into a room you are no longer certain is occupied. This is precisely the terrain in which the deepest surrender becomes possible. Because when you have something to hold, when faith feels good, when God feels near, when prayer produces consolation, and the spiritual life has a certain texture and warmth to it, trust is real, but it has something beneath it. You are trusting, and you also have the felt experience of God's presence as a kind of floor. The trust can waver, and the floor catches you. But when the floor is gone, when there is nothing beneath you but the bare fact of what you have chosen to believe, the choice you made in the light and now have to honor in the dark, that is when trust becomes something Thérèse called living by love. Not living sustained by the feeling of love. Not living on the emotional consolation of a relationship that feels warm and present. Living from the sheer act of choosing love, from the bare bones of a decision made in the dark with nothing but the memory of light and the stubbornness of a soul that will not conclude God has abandoned it simply because it cannot feel Him. Is this where you are? Some of you already know. The prayer that has gone unanswered for so long that you have started to wonder whether you are praying to anyone or whether the words you are sending up are simply returning to you changed in shape. The relationship with God that used to feel like something, textured, warm, occasionally consoling, and now feels like a posture you maintain out of fidelity, because you promised you would, and because you are not the kind of person who breaks promises, without knowing, honestly, whether the posture is enough. The suffering that has not resolved, the door that has not opened, the healing that has not arrived, the child whose life is going somewhere you cannot follow, the diagnosis that has not improved, the grief that has not diminished in the way everyone told you it would. Thérèse would not tell you to feel better. She would not hand you a spiritual technique for recovering the consolations you have lost, as though the right breathing exercise or devotional practice would restore what only God can restore and only at the time of His choosing. She would sit with you at that table, the table she described, the one set in the dark, the one where the people who cannot taste God eat together. She would tell you from inside that experience that the darkness is not the absence of God. It is the crucible in which something is being formed in you that can only be formed in conditions that cannot be produced artificially, in the specific darkness of unchosen powerlessness. And she would say this: the surrender that happens at the bottom of your resources, when you have genuinely nothing left to manage with, when there are no options remaining and no strategy left to try. That surrender is different from the surrender that happens when you still have options. Not superior. God does not rank surrenders by depth or difficulty, but it is complete in a way that the earlier kind rarely is, because there is nothing left to withhold. The thing you were most afraid to let go of has been let go of not because you were spiritually heroic, but because you had no other choice. And in that moment of no other choice, something becomes available to God that was not available before. The powerlessness is not the end of the story. In the economy of a God who raised His Son from the dead, powerlessness is almost always where the story actually begins. People ask the wrong question about surrender. They ask, "What will I have to give up?" They circle the invitation with a kind of spiritual arithmetic, tallying the potential cost, measuring the perceived risk, wondering how much of themselves, how much of their agency, their plans, their sense of being in control of their own existence, they will lose if they actually let go. And the question is not entirely wrong. Surrender does cost something, and Thérèse would never dishonor that cost by minimizing it or wrapping it in language designed to make it seem easier than it is. She was always honest about cost, but it is the wrong question to start with, because it positions God as someone making a demand, as the party on the other side of a negotiation, identifying what He requires and waiting to see whether you will meet the price. And when God is experienced as demand rather than invitation, the entire spiritual conversation shifts into a register of anxiety and calculation that prevents the very thing surrender is meant to produce. The right question, Thérèse's question, is this: what does surrender actually produce? Not in the sense of what you receive in exchange for compliance, as though this were a transaction with terms you could evaluate and agree to or decline, but genuinely, what happens to a soul that has given everything over? Not performed giving over, not the language of surrender practiced as a spiritual aesthetic while the hands remain tightly closed, but genuine, meant daily renewed giving over of everything, including the thing you were most afraid to release. What is the interior landscape of someone who is genuinely not trying to manage God anymore? Thérèse answers this not abstractly, but by living it, and by leaving us the record of what it looked like from the inside, and what her life produces in the testimony of those who knew her, in the letters she wrote, in the autobiography she was asked to write, and which became one of the most widely read spiritual documents of the 20th century, is something that the word peace almost captures but does not quite contain. It is something closer to freedom. Not freedom from difficulty. Her life remained difficult until its final breath, and in some ways became harder in the final months than it had been at any point before. Not freedom from suffering. She suffered greatly, in body and in soul, and she never claimed otherwise. Not freedom from the ordinary friction and limitation of an embodied human life in a specific historical moment, in a specific small city in Normandy, in a specific community of women she had not chosen and could not leave, but freedom from the particular and exhausting labor of being the primary architect of her own destiny, freedom from the tyranny of the outcome, the grinding, constant need for the results of her life to confirm that she was on the right path, that her choices were correct, that the investment of her whole being was going somewhere worth going. Freedom from the need for her life to arrange itself according to a plan she had authored, because the plan had been genuinely given to someone else, and she had meant it, and had gone on meaning it, even on the days when it cost her more than she felt she had. There is a passage in Story of a Soul where she describes her relationship to God using the image of a little bird. The little bird, she says, is too small and too weak to soar like the eagles. The great mystics, the dramatic saints, the souls who have climbed to the heights of contemplation, by paths she has neither the strength nor the capacity to follow. Its wings are insufficient for that flight. It cannot reach the sun by its own power, and it knows this about itself without shame or self-pity, simply as a fact, the way a sparrow knows it is not an eagle and is not lesser for it. And so the little bird sits. It looks upward. It does not pretend to be something it is not. It does not manufacture an altitude it cannot actually achieve. And it trusts, with the particular, simple, almost radical trust of something that has no other option, that the sun knows it is there, and that its gaze, fixed upward in love rather than in accomplishment, is worth something to the God who made both eagles and sparrows. That image is not merely poetry. It is a complete and precise theology of surrender, rendered in the language of a young woman who had read John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, and understood them in a way that the scholarly commentators sometimes do not as programs to be implemented, not as ladders to be climbed rung by rung, but as descriptions of what love actually requires at the deepest level, which is the willingness to be present to God as you actually are. Not as you wish you were, not as you might someday become with sufficient effort and grace, but now, in this moment, in this form, with these particular limitations and this particular history and this particular unremarkable life that is, nonetheless, entirely yours and entirely offered. What surrender produces in the soul that genuinely and persistently practices it is this: the capacity to be present to the moment that is actually happening rather than the moment you are trying to engineer into existence, to the person in front of you right now, your spouse, your child, your parent, your colleague, rather than the version of that person you are hoping to produce through the right combination of love and management and strategic patience. To God as He is actually moving in your life, which is sometimes not in the direction you requested and not at the speed you hoped, rather than the God you have asked to appear and confirm your preferred direction. This is not a minor thing. In a world organized almost entirely around the production of future outcomes, the career you are slowly building, the family you are working to protect, the security you are attempting to construct against the possibility of disaster, the version of your life you are patiently assembling from your best intentions and your accumulated choices, to be genuinely present to what is actually here, to what God is actually doing in this moment rather than the next one, is a radical and somewhat countercultural act. It is also, Thérèse would say, the precondition for the kind of love that the little way is trying to describe. Because when you are not managing the outcome, you are free to love the moment. When the future is not yours to control, the present becomes the whole field of your attention and your offering. This prayer, this person, this small act of fidelity, this day that is actually in front of you rather than the day you are trying to organize 3 weeks from now, these become not just the means to an end, but the end itself, the place where God is and where love happens. She wrote, toward the end of her life, with the clarity that sometimes descends on those who are dying and who know it, who have been stripped of the luxury of deferring the most important things. Everything is grace. She was not performing contentment. She was not producing a spiritual sentiment for the benefit of those who would read her words after she was gone. She was reporting what she saw from where she was standing, which was at the very end of her resources, in the final weeks of a painful death, with the darkness she had described still present around her. Everything, she said, not some things, not the pleasant things, not the things she would have chosen. Everything, the suffering and the joy, the darkness and the moments of light within the darkness, the answered prayers and the long unanswered ones, the life she had and not the life she had wanted. Everything is the medium through which God is present to her. Everything is the material of grace. That is what surrender produces. Not immunity from difficulty, not a life arranged according to your preferences, smoothed out by faith into something comfortable and explicable, but the discovery that God was already in the difficulty, that He was already present in the thing you were trying to control, that the release of your grip was not the loss of something precious, as it felt it might be, but the opening of your hands, the same you, no different except for the fact of the open hands, so that you could finally receive what was already being offered. You have been carrying something. You know what it is. The invitation has not changed. The arms are the same arms they have always been. Before you knew about them, before you tried to manage without them, before all the long and honest effort of your life. And Thérèse, who learned this not from a book, but from the interior of her own surrender, who discovered it not once but in the daily repetition of a small life faithfully lived, she is with you in this moment. Not as a distant figure in a stained glass window, as someone who promised, from her deathbed, to spend her heaven doing good on earth, as someone who has never stopped keeping that promise, who is present in the particular dark of your particular life, accompanying you toward the same surrender she chose and the same freedom it produced. Give it to Him, not because it will stop hurting immediately, not because the outcome will be what you want, or what you asked for, or what you have been waiting for, but because the grip has become heavier than you were made to carry, and because the God who made you small enough to need Him is the same God who made His arms large enough to hold you and everything you are holding. You stayed. You made it to the end of something that asked something of you, not just your time, but your attention and maybe something more than that. Maybe something you brought here that you had not planned to bring. A question you have been carrying for longer than you can remember. A weight you have not named out loud. A place in you that is still, quietly, figuring out what surrender actually means in your particular life. Not in the abstract, not in the beautiful language of a saint's autobiography, but in the specific and sometimes very difficult circumstances of who you are and what you are living right now. I want to acknowledge that, because I know that not everyone makes it here. If Thérèse is speaking to something real in you, if her way is not just intellectually beautiful, but genuinely yours, the path you feel called to walk even when it costs you, even when it does not feel like anything, I want to invite you into our membership community. It is a smaller space, a closer conversation, a place where we go deeper together into the spirituality of the little way. Not as a curiosity, not as an intellectual interest, but as a practice, a daily choice, a life where your questions are welcome, where you are not alone in your particular dark, where Thérèse accompanies all of us, and where that companionship is felt in a more specific and ongoing way than a single video can hold. The link is below this video. Come and be covered too.